Live from the MacGyver Project studios in sunny, warm Wisconsin, it's Nick with a special edition of the Olympic Legends podcast and the Outstanding Authors podcast. This is the fourth episode of Olympic Legends that I've done, and it's the first time I'm talking about an Olympian instead of to an Olympian. And it's my first edition of the Outstanding Authors podcast where I read a book and then discuss the book with the author. Not all books will be about the Olympics, but in some cases like this one, it will fit under both umbrellas. So I'm going to give you a very quick background on Jim Thorpe in case you're unfamiliar with him. He was born in Indian Territory in 1887 in what is now Oklahoma. He had a mix of European and Indian ancestry, but he identified himself as Native American. He ended up attending the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania and became a football star as the school played against all the major colleges of the day. Actually saying he was a football star is an understatement. He was the best player of the era and one of the greatest football players of all time. He goes to the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm and dominates the field on the way to winning gold medals in both the pentathlon and the decathlon. But these medals were taken away the following year when it was discovered that he had previously played 2 summers of professional baseball in North Carolina. He then went on to be a pro football star and also a very good baseball player in Major League Baseball. And after his athletic career was over, he was in 70 Hollywood movies as an actor or an extra. He died in 1953 at the age of 65, and he's currently buried in a town that bears his name, Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, which is actually about half an hour from where I grew up. So the book that I'll be discussing is called Native American Son, The Life and Sporting Legend of Jim Thorpe, and the author is Kate Buford. Kate's also written a critically acclaimed biography about the life of Burt Lancaster, and you can find her online at www.katebuford.com. She has a blog at www.newbestfriendsforever.com, and you can follow her on Twitter at Kate Buford. And if you're looking for a Christmas gift, consider buying Native American Son, The Life and Sporting Legend of Jim Thorpe. One last thing I'll say about this, since it's my first author discussion podcast, is that my goal here is not to summarize the entire book, but instead to talk about elements of the book that I found interesting or want to learn more about. So what we're talking about today is just a small fraction of what's in the book. So if you want to learn more, once again, I hope you'll read the book. So with that, let's give Kate a call.
Hello.
Hi, Kate.
Hi, is this Nick?
Hi, this is Nick. Hey.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you tonight?
Very well, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for taking time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
I'm glad to.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the book. It was really good. I really learned a lot, and I was curious. First question was, why did you write the book? What got you interested in Jim Thorpe?
The biography that I wrote before this one was a biography of Burt Lancaster, the Hollywood actor and producer, and he played Jim Thorpe in a Warner Brothers 1951 biopic, as they say in Hollywood, a story of Thorpe's life. Thorpe was still alive at the time, and when I was doing research on that movie, as I had to do for the Lancaster research for the book, I was so struck in the production files out in Los Angeles with the story. I just thought this was an amazing story. And I was also struck in the production file, and the movie was made in 1950 and was released in 1951. So it's halfway through the century. And I was so struck by how many postcards and letters, including from a very young Bobby Kennedy, came flooding into Warner Brothers saying, "Don't mess with our hero. Get this right." And he hadn't played a game since 1928 and had been out of sports for a long time, although everyone remembered him vividly. He was like the gold standard, you know. But I just thought, as a writer, you look for that kind of passion. And I thought, well, why did they care so much so long after he played any games? What did he mean to so many people? And that's what started the book. I mean, I didn't get the idea right then, but then I decided, well, I didn't want to write about movies again. So I wanted, and sports is so big now for girls, boys, men, women. It's everything now. And I thought, well, where does it begin? And you can argue it begins, the first international celebrity athlete was Jim Thorpe. So he kicks it off, literally. And it was fascinating.
Yeah, Bobby Kennedy really wrote a scathing letter to Warner Brothers
Yeah,
That was
isn't that
interesting.
something?
Yeah.
I had to consult with the Kennedy family to confirm that it was him and his handwriting, and they said it was one of probably his earliest handwritten letters as an adult. He just finished law school, and it was probably one of his very first examples of him going to champion the underdog, which of course became his political mission in life. But this letter, he probably was 22, something like that. And it's quite some letter. I was really delighted to find it.
And what did Warner Brothers do that people were upset about?
Well, it was not actually true. Kennedy's anger was based on a story that Thorpe's wife, his third wife, to whom he was married at that time, she was putting, as you probably remember from the book, she was really kind of a piece of work, and she was putting a lot of pressure on Warner Brothers to pay him more, do this, do that. I mean, she drove Warner Brothers crazy, and she didn't leave Thorpe, but she stopped being involved in the production of that movie. But she had convinced through clever press stories from different reporters that this rumor went out that he was being paid nothing for this movie about his life, and that he was destitute, according to her, and that they were treating him really badly. So that's what Bobby Kennedy was reacting against. But in fact, he was paid for that movie and got a lot of good out of it.
So starting with his early life, I was curious if you had gone to Oklahoma, the area where he was born, and what it was like.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Oklahoma. That's a good question. You have to. If you're doing a biography of anybody, you have to go where they lived. And try, even if the buildings are still there. In the case of Lancaster, they mostly were. But in the case of Thorpe, yes, he grew up east of Oklahoma City, near what's now Shawnee, a thriving small town, or not too tiny, but a good size, but not enormous. And he grew up before there was a Shawnee. He grew up when it was just a reservation. And it was... and if you remember from the book, a very free childhood, lots of impromptu games of all kinds. He was free. And I went there, and two of his daughters were still living in that area. Where he was born is now a little town called Prague. It's spelled the same as Prague in Czechoslovakia, but it's pronounced Prague in Oklahoma. And that's truly a tiny town. And it's right near where he was born and grew up, and two of his daughters had returned there, and they became very helpful to me. And then one of his sons, two of his sons actually, well, three altogether were helpful, but two lived in Oklahoma, and one, Jack, lived in Shawnee. So I spent many weeks out there working in the archives, but also getting to know those Thorpe kids. I mean, they were much older than I am, and they've all died except two now. They're quite elderly. But it was, I really came to like it. Oklahoma's gets sort of overlooked because Texas, makes so much noise.
Yeah.
And, Oklahoma's a smaller state. And as someone said to me when I was starting this book, it's a very intimate state. Everyone knows everybody else. And I just met some of the most terrific people I've ever met there, and came to really be fond of the state. And where Thorpe was born is right along the North Canadian River, and it's sort of like meadows and not rolling hills. It's not totally flat. It goes up and down a little bit, but not much, and kind of scrubby trees and grass and bushes. It's not particularly lush, but then it's also really kind of attractive, too. It's not barren at all. It's not like the high plains.
Is there anything there that commemorates him? Like, does it say Jim Thorpe is from here? Any kind of memorial or monument?
Yeah, well, in Yale, Oklahoma, which is just up the road, or the highway a little bit from Prague, is the house that Jim and his first wife, Iva, bought. It's the only house he ever really owned, and it's maintained as the Jim Thorpe home. It's an historic site, so you can go there and see where he lived through a good part of the teens and the 1920s. And there's also what's left of the Sac and Fox Reservation, which is near Stroud, which is between Prague and Yale. So all these little places in there have memorials and mementos of Jim Thorpe.
Okay. I was curious, too, what the Carlisle Indian College is like, if it's still there. I actually have been to the barracks there when I was a kid in the kind of mid to late 80s. My grandfather lived in Carlisle, or actually, no, he lived in, he lived in Harrisburg, but we went to Carlisle, to the Army post there, because he was in the Army, and we would go for Thanksgiving, and they would have a buffet, and I don't actually remember it that well as far as, like I know the school was in that area, but I don't really remember seeing it, but I was curious if it's even still there, or what it's like.
Yeah, that's another really good question. The school, the original Carlisle Indian Industrial School, it closed in 1918, so it's no longer a school. Mm-hmm. But it was taken over by the Army War College, which is where your grandfather comes in, I'm sure.
Right.
And so you can go visit the Army War College, and the original setup of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School is still there, and it's preserved as a national landmark. So you can see the gym where it's called the Thorpe Gym, where Jim Thorpe would have played. There's also the athlete's house, the place where Pop Warner housed all the athletes and fed them so well and took care of them. There's the bandstand in the middle of the big lawn. There's the superintendent's house. So you can go there, and really they preserved it almost exactly the way that it looked back when Jim was there.
Can anyone just go and get a tour there?
I think so. Yeah, I've been many times. I've been often, and an important resource for anybody really interested in this is in Carlisle town itself, in the city, is the Cumberland County Historical Society. And if you go in there, you will get terrific help on, research about Thorpe if someone wants to do research on him there, but also they can give you any pointers on how to go to the Army War College and what's open and what's not.
Okay.
But that Historical Society has been very, very active in keeping up the memory of Jim Thorpe.
It seemed to me like the Carlisle school was kind of like, I couldn't really tell if it was more like a high school or a college, like, because Jim, I think, was like 24 or 25 at the end there, and they're playing football against these colleges, but yet they have a lot of kids who are more like high school age, too.
Yeah. It was a very different time from now. The NCAA was barely getting on its feet, so there were not very strict rules about who competed with whom. So, for example, Carlisle, which really basically was a vocational school that went up to about 8th grade level, and but people stayed on there for a long time, like Jim Thorpe. But this happened also at colleges like Yale and Harvard. They would have very good players that they would just keep on forever because they could win games. And when the NCAA really got going, of course, they started to make rules against that. But when Jim Thorpe is there and Pop Warner is there as his coach in the team's, late, 1909, 1910, 11, 12, in particular 11 and 12, 1912, Pop Warner was a very ambitious coach, as you probably picked up from the book, and he really pressured schools like Harvard and West Point and Syracuse and Penn and Georgetown. Those were all real colleges, obviously, as they are now. But they were scheduled to play against this little Indian industrial school, and there were no rules against it. So your point is really good, that here were these, they were what we would call high school age, and in Jim's case, into their 20s, because the rules were so flexible. And then they began to tighten up, as I say in my book, as they began to realize that people were abusing these rules a lot. So you got basically adults playing against teenagers, which wasn't fair.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting, the description of football back then, a lot of parallels between then and now as far as like the power of athletics at colleges, and I didn't realize how almost like how similar it was to today, like the importance of football and money to the school. It's really interesting.
Yeah, that was really, and I love the history of football. It's so fascinating. Yeah. And when Thorpe and Warner are are playing and coaching the game. The rules are changing by the year as they try to figure out, the football's basically then only played in the Northeast, slowly going to the Midwest, and slowly to the West, and will only later get to the South. But the game's pretty new, and it's pretty raw, and so the rules are changing every year. And, very powerful and rich alumni at Yale and Harvard slipped money under the table to really good athletes in order to buy them special apartments, all the cigarettes they wanted. They wanted to lure them because they wanted, and let's say it's Yale, they wanted Yale to beat Harvard, so they would support these athletes and give them money, which of course went against the amateur ideal of the time. But it went on just as badly at these great big fancy schools as it did at Carlisle. Carlisle didn't have any alumni or anybody wealthy, but Pop Warner tried to make up for that by all kinds of ploys and stratagems that he used.
And am I right that they pretty much played all their games on the road? Like they didn't have any home games?
No, they didn't. Well, because they didn't really have a stadium. Yeah. They just had a practice field with some bleachers. So the early season games were played against local easy schools like Lafayette or Albright school back then, and then they would work their way up to West Point or Harvard or Syracuse or Penn. But, yeah, they were always on the road, which meant they didn't get to class very often in the fall.
Yeah. And one question I had about the rules was, when it comes to kicking, like there were some references to how great of a kicker he was and like drop kicking. Were the kicking rules the same as today, or it almost sounded to me a little bit like rugby, like where you just kind of like kick on the run? I don't know if I was understanding that right, but
no, they didn't kick on the run. I mean, the drop kick, you don't see that too often anymore now. But then it won games. It was really and Jim Thorpe was very, very good at it. So, yeah, to that extent, you could do a drop kick. That is sort of like rugby. But there was also the field goal at the end, or the field goal to get one extra point for a touchdown or to score 3 points when it's done on its own. And, of course, Jim in one game against Harvard in 1911 won that game with 4 place kicks that were just amazing, one of them from virtually the 50-yard line. So, yeah, the drop kick that he was so good at just pretty much vanished. I think Doug Flutie a few years ago had a great play. I can't remember what game it was, but everybody was talking about it in the sports pages that, oh, my gosh, we haven't seen a drop kick in so long.
And as far as the Olympics, I was curious with the medals being taken away. It seemed to me like it was actually the AAU that kind of spearheaded it rather than the IOC, which is what I would have guessed. So it kind of surprised me that the AAU would kind of like go after one of their own.
Yeah, well, again, we're talking brand new. I mean, the Olympics were only, that was only the 5th Olympiad in 1912 in Stockholm, where Jim won the 2 gold medals in the decathlon and the pentathlon. And so the IOC existed, of course, as the overall umbrella organization, but locally here in the United States, the AAU governed the tryouts, and the first time they had tryouts was for 1912. The AAU was very powerful, and so they were the court of first resort. Mm-hmm. And when it was discovered that Jim was not an amateur, that he had played professional baseball for those 2 summers in 1909 and 1910, amateurism being the huge big issue of the day, in a week he was stripped of his medals and his trophies. And the AAU made that decision. But the IOC had to vote later in the spring of 1913 when they met in Europe for their annual meeting. They had to finalize the fact that the records would be struck and that he was eliminated as having been a contender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what you were saying at the beginning about how, like with Warner Brothers and people were lining up to support him, it seemed like people throughout his life were really in his corner trying to get the medals back, and that Avery Brundage, the IOC chair, could have restored them, but he actually had lost to Thorpe in the Olympics, which I thought was interesting. And he seemed like kind of like a little bit of a horse's bottom, I guess you could say.
He was. He was really disliked. He was a real stuffed shirt. And you're right. I don't think he ever got over the fact that he, not only did he lose to Jim Thorpe, I mean, Jim Thorpe beat all the contestants in both the decathlon and pentathlon by a huge margin, huge. And Avery Brundage didn't even qualify. You know, he didn't even last for the full 10 events of the decathlon. And he had assumed that he would win, and he would, he'd be the great athlete. And so there was an element always, I think, of chagrin and envy on the part of Avery Brundage, particularly when he became head of the IOC. But then he also completely identified with being the spokesperson for the ideal of amateurism, that you could never be paid anything for playing a sport. That would make you a professional. And that whole ideal was crumbling under his feet. I mean, it never really was that real. I mean, it was so abused.
Right.
And it was a snobbish thing. It was a way of keeping people who couldn't afford to support themselves without a job and train, out of sports. But you put your finger on it when you said about all the letters and cards that were flooding into Warner Brothers in 1950 when they were making that movie about Jim Thorpe. People identified with him, starting with that scandal in 1912 when he was stripped of his medals for being a professional. People saw that it smelled, it was wrong. He played baseball in those 2 summers. Yes, he got money for it. Yes, he was a professional, but he competed in track and field at the Olympics. And there was this feeling that if he'd been a Harvard boy or a Yale boy, that somebody would have figured it out and protected him. But nobody did. He had nobody to front for him, and Warner certainly didn't. And people identified with him. They felt like, here's the greatest athlete in the world who's done amazing things, came out of nowhere, a little Indian guy coming out of Oklahoma. He could have been any one of them. And he showed the world how great he was just by a fantastic body and fantastic discipline and skills. And at a time when people were very snobbish and you had to be born in the right place and go to the right school, people just embraced him as almost like a folk hero. And they didn't forget. And you're right, they were in his corner, and they kept this up for decades and decades and decades, even after he was dead. He just seemed to symbolize to the average person that they could have been him. It could have been anybody. If they were really great athletes, could have shown the world that all you had to do was, have a great body and be really good at sports. And you could be as good as anybody else.
Yeah, and it really is too bad he didn't get them back in his own life, because it seemed like he really was affected and troubled by that, which isn't surprising because most people would be affected by it.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, think about what it would felt like. Here he was. I mean, he was very shy and didn't like a lot of attention paid to him. And by nature and by training as a Native American, they, by and large, particularly then, were trained to see things as group efforts. You didn't stick out. You didn't claim glory and fame for yourself. You gave credit to your team. And his teammates at Carlisle always respected that with him, and that's why they were devoted to him. But here he is thrust into the world stage and just astonishes the world, the first international celebrity athlete. And 6 months later, it's all stripped away. And he hardly knew how to cope with the fame, and then he has to cope with the scandal, and didn't quite know why it had happened. He relied on Pop Warner to front for him. And Pop Warner, left him out to dry.
Yeah.
It's really sad. Yeah.
And then for the post-Olympic years, he's on the road just like all the time. Like I can't even keep track. Like he's playing football in Ohio, baseball in New York. He goes to Florida, Montana, basketball. Like, the amount of traveling he did just throughout his life is just insane. Like the amount of time he must have spent on a train. And he's a family too, which he's not seen very much. And as far as the football, if you asked me before I read the book, I kind of associate him more with the Olympics, and I knew he played football and baseball, but I didn't realize just how great of a football player he was. Like, he seemed like one of, if not the best football player of his era. I mean, maybe even ever, and just like really tough, fearless guy who didn't seem to get hurt, even though that era of football was super violent. It seemed like he was always just delivering body blows, and he always was just, his body just seemed kind of like indestructible.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he got dubbed the Iron Man, which now, is almost a cliche. You're right. I mean, he just had this amazing physical body that could do anything. And he was extremely strong, as well as being fast and agile. But yes, you're right. He was one of the great, great early football players. Just as the game is becoming pretty much what we would recognize today, with the rules and the downs and the this and the that were all kind of being, and the forward pass. But he was a great running back. That was his position. But yeah, he played two sports, football and baseball, straight out from 1913 to 1928. And then he added basketball in 1927. He played three sports in 1927. And, so you're right. It put him on the road all the time. It did not, but now, we can look at athletes' lives and we see the toll that sports takes on a gifted athlete. And family life often suffers. So if you look at Thorpe's life, he's almost like the model of what's to come. The great glory, and then you fall off from it. And the body can only do amazing things for so long, and then it won't do it anymore. And what do you do with the rest of your life? And one of the really interesting things about the book for me that no one had ever looked at really carefully at all was when he had finished with sports, that last game in 1928, or, a quarter of a game, because he was just really not capable anymore. He goes to Hollywood, as so many athletes did, former athletes, and he creates a whole other career in Hollywood, mostly playing extras, mostly often uncredited parts, but nevertheless, he went out there and made a whole different life for himself out there, which somebody said to me that the word about Thorpe, thinking about your comment about how he was always on the road, that people don't usually associate with him, is perseverance. And he just kept at it. His whole life, whether it was sports or the movies or making those speeches with the Chautauqua circuit all over the country. He had to make a living. He had to make the best of it. And he became famous and was at his peak before athletes were making major money. So he made a good living up until the mid-20s, 1920s, but he never made like Babe Ruth, or Jack Dempsey, or Bobby Jones, any of these, Big Bill Tilden, the tennis player. These people had agents. They had testimonials where they said, I love to smoke Lucky Strike cigarettes. They get paid thousands of dollars for, being in an ad. He missed out on all that, which is one of the many ironies of his career.
Yeah, it seemed like he was just kind of scraping by financially throughout his life, and with the baseball, I thought that was interesting too, in that he doesn't have the same kind of innate ability like he did in football, and he struggled for a long time, but he really, like you mentioned, perseverance. Like, he really stuck with it, and by the end, he's pretty good. Yeah,
he was very good.
Yeah.
He was leading the National League in batting, in 1919, which was a discovery that everyone had forgotten about. I just dug it out of some file, and that's a very good point that you make, because I remember Frank DeFord, the sports writer and broadcaster, and he and I were doing a show once, and he said to me about Thorpe, he said, or in sports in general, he said, there's something about that little white ball in baseball that can really confuse and mess up the greatest athletes.
Yeah.
It's a different sport,
Yeah.
And he was never that good at it before he got to the major leagues. He hadn't done that well when he left Carlisle for those 2 years to go play in North Carolina professional baseball, minor league, but nevertheless professional. And so when the scandal broke in January 1913, the Olympic scandal, he, and this is where Warner even said later he regretted it. Warner, because he got a cut, he got a commission, he set up a contract with the New York Giants, who were then like, I don't know, the Yankees or the San Francisco Giants now. That's who they are now. But a few years ago, we would have said they were like the Yankees of their day. They were the biggest, baddest team. They were really good, and they had a really tough manager. And here he is dropped into the major leagues, and he's never hit curveballs. He's never even seen one. And so he struggled, and you're right, but he just kept at it. He was farmed out to the minors, back and forth from 1913 to 1919, 1920, and he just kept getting enough at-bats that he got better and better. But it didn't, you're right, it did not come naturally to him at all. And he didn't really like baseball that much because, I say this in the book, it's slow, and you have to wait for the next inning to get your turn at bat again. With football, it's bam, you're on to the next play, fast, fast, fast. And that was the sport that he was brilliant at and that suited his own tempo.
Right.
He loved football.
And how would you describe his personality? You mentioned he was an introvert and kind of shy by nature, but what else? How else would you describe it?
He had a kind of goofy sense of humor. He liked to play practical jokes. I mean, nothing really destructive, but he just had almost like a childlike sense of humor where he liked to see people surprised, and so he'd play these sort of mild practical jokes. Very relaxed before he got in, life got complicated at Carlisle. His friends remembered him as always laughing and always sort of goofing off and happy and very generous. All to the end of his life. I mean, friends that I spoke to that knew him in the 1940s and then just before his death in the early 50s, I mean, never had that much money, but if somebody else needed it, he'd borrow it from somebody else to give it to the person who needed it, He had a real empathy with people less off than himself, and that was really difficult with him. The other characteristic of him that one of his friends noted to me is that he said the word I was not his vocabulary. He didn't talk about himself. He didn't, if he was talking at all, he didn't like to talk. He always said, if you're talking, you can't listen. So and that's very Native American, at least among the people that he grew up with. You're quiet and you observe. You don't strut your stuff. You don't talk a lot because what are you going to talk about? He would just watch, and that was a key to a lot of his success in sports, was observing. And this was very true of a lot of the Indian athletes at Carlisle. Pop Warner noticed this. They would just watch and take apart how somebody did a certain sports activity, and then they would copy it. He could be very funny in a very dry, witty way. People were very, very loyal to him because he was just so humble and self-effacing for someone who'd done so much. And he never really lost that, even when times got really tough. He had problems. He had a temper. He drank too much, but I don't think he drank any more than people drank back then. I mean, well, even fast forward to Mickey Mantle, heavy drinkers. A lot of athletes were. A lot of men were back then. Drinking was kind of a rite of passage, and he was labeled as being a drinker as much because he was Native American, and that was a stereotype that was attached to them. But actually, everybody drank, and they drank a lot, but a lot more than we would be used to today.
And one thing I found really interesting was when he was 58 years old, he enlisted in the Merchant Marine during World War II. Like when I read that, I kind of had to read it again and think, like, really, like he would do that at 58. I thought it was interesting and really kind of commendable on his part that he would serve at that age.
Yeah, he felt badly that he had not served in the First World War. I mean, he was married with children, so there was an exemption. And he was too old to serve in any of the usual armed services by the time the Second World War came along in 1941. And so after Pearl Harbor, so he just wanted to do his bit. I mean, he was a patriot, and many, many, many Native Americans signed up instantly. I mean, they were one of all the sub-ethnic groups in the country, they have such a high level of registration for serving in the service. So he found the one service that would take him, and that was the Merchant Marine. And it was brief because the war was over just a few months after he joined, but he did get on that ship and go across the Pacific, and I tracked down some of his shipmates, which was really interesting.
Yeah, it's really neat.
Yeah, they remembered him fondly.
So, kind of getting toward the end of his life then with his third wife, Patsy, you touched on it a little bit, but she seemed like kind of a bad influence, to say the least. I mean, I guess she spoke up for him, I guess on the plus side. She tried to get him some work and some money, but she just seemed kind of like unhinged and like it was more about her.
Yeah, that's a complicated marriage. I mean, all marriages are complicated. Yeah, but that one really was. Jim's children couldn't stand her because they saw the worst side of her, and she drank a lot. She spent money a lot, even though you're right, she did. She felt he'd really been abused, that he had not been charging enough for appearances, and he was the most famous athlete in the world, and he should be much better compensated for his services and his appearances. So to her credit, she really went to bat for him to be paid better. But then she spent it according to the children. But then there was that other old friend, Bill Thorpe, who I found later, much later, who had hung around with him as a very young man, and this would be the late 40s, early 50s. And he loved Patsy. I mean, he said she just fought for them, and she was a lion, I think was the word he used. But he was the only one I found who would speak that way of her. But he lived with them, for quite a while, and everybody's complicated. I think in her heart of hearts, she wanted the best for him and felt really badly that he had just not got a fair deal. But she had her own demons, and they got in the way. And certainly the whole making of that movie, Jim Thorpe All American, she drove Warner Brothers nuts with her, really, as you said, unhinged requests. So it was hard on him at the end. It was very hard.
Was it accurate to say that they got married like within a couple of days of meeting? Did I read that correctly?
Well, according to her, they had met briefly years earlier in the 1920s.
Okay. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
But then had not even seen each other. And so a mutual friend got them back together again. So I think they'd known each other. I mean, they knew each other as acquaintances from a long time ago. But, yeah, the story was, I mean, that he told, or they both told, was that, he woke up one morning and there she was. So, yeah. Marriages were like that back then. I mean, wartime. People, although he married her just before he went off in the Merchant Marine, but it was the wartime. People got married in a couple of days all the time because no one knew what was coming next.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the burial controversy. So I'm actually from the Lehigh Valley, so only about half an hour from Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, and I'll just kind of summarize, not for you, but for people who are listening. The ceremony's going on in Oklahoma with the tribe, and she comes in with police and basically removes the body and kind of looks for a place to almost like auction it off to the highest bidder, it seems like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. And then she hears about this town, Mauch Chunk in Pennsylvania, and how they're looking to kind of get back on the map, and she makes a deal with them, and they rename the town. They take his body, and it sounds like they have plans to do a lot of museum type stuff and make it an industry, and it doesn't really take off. In fact, and maybe I should have known this, but I didn't even realize he was buried there, even though I lived there. I'd never been to the grave. I didn't even realize. I've actually been to the Asa Packer Mansion and got a tour of that, but when I was a kid, and we went on like the Jim Thorpe Railroad, but never went to the burial site. Didn't even know it was there. So definitely was not a big tourist attraction there. And so now he's been buried there for almost 60 years, and his family, some of his sons wanted him back in Oklahoma, and they sued, and it got appealed, and it looked like maybe it was going to win, but then it got appealed, and the judge decided that the body's going to stay in Jim Thorpe, and the Supreme Court decided not to hear the tribe's appeal. So I was just curious, your whole take on that.
Yeah, boy, you can't make it up. It's one of the strangest stories.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah,
very hard. I have to say, going back to the beginning with Patsy, the wife, and the body being taken away, I mean, that really hurt the children a great deal. It was as if, well, according to the Native American ceremony that they were doing, his spirit was not then at rest because it hadn't been completed. So that ate away at them, for decades. But Patsy, to her credit, again, she's a little unhinged, but she was trying to get an appropriate memorial. And at first, Oklahoma was going to do it, and then they withdrew the money, and then she tried for Tulsa, and Anadarko, and then eventually ends up. And Carlisle was willing to take the body, and then she strikes a deal with this town, Mount Chunk, actually two Mount Chunk and Mount Chunk, and they consolidate and name themselves Jim Thorpe, and in exchange for the body. And the sons, the Thorpe sons, always felt that she had gotten money or that she was shopping around. Carlisle did say, the Army War College did say, well, she asked for too much money. So there was an element of wanting money for all her efforts. The sons probably still think, I know Jack did, who died a few years ago after filing the lawsuit for the repatriation of the remains. Jack really felt that she had gotten a lot of money, but the town didn't have any money. Nobody had any money. That was the whole point. They needed to pull themselves up out of the bootstraps, the anthracite coal business that had made Asa Packer and these other people millionaires at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. That business was all gone. And so the whole reason that she went to Mount Chunk was that they were trying to raise the money to build a plant, to bring a factory there to give jobs to their young high school graduates and returning Korean War veterans. So there was no money, and she was paid for her expenses, evidently. And anyway, what I felt about the whole thing was it was bizarre, and yet it had a kind of logic in the early 50s for this town trying to make something of itself. And then there were all these deals promised. There was going to be the Pro Football Hall of Fame was going to go there. It wasn't in Canton yet. There was going to be a Jim Thorpe sports good factory. There was going to be a hospital for elderly or sick athletes. And none of this came to pass. And the town, in the end, pulled itself up by its own bootstraps because, as you know, it's a charming town with wonderful Victorian architecture, the Asa Packer Mansion being the most famous. But they had it's almost like a fairy tale. They had everything they needed, but they didn't know it. And once they decided to, pay attention to what they already had and develop it as a tourist destination, they've done extremely well. And Jim Thorpe had nothing to do with that. As you say, you didn't go out to see it. Well, most people didn't. It wasn't promoted as a tourist attraction. They were very adamant about that, Jim Thorpe. They wanted it to be a place of dignified rest for Jim Thorpe. So it's outside of town a little bit, and you don't obviously find it unless you're looking for it. For me, in terms of the legal case, my book ended up being for the Supreme Court appeal. That was the final appeal to the Supreme Court. The Stanford Law School Supreme Court Clinic in California were the ones that filed the petition to the Supreme Court. And my book was the basis for their factual background section in that petition, which was really great. Yeah. And so they asked me, too, well, where do you come on this issue? And I always felt that it was two kinds of law. Because the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, that was the act under which Jack Thorpe filed the original lawsuit in Pennsylvania. And that law was enacted in 1990 to try to correct this this appropriation of Native American remains for museums, for private collections, for ways that were not respectful of the tradition out of which they came, and that there had to be a law that enforced the return of these artifacts to their rightful owners or to the tribes or to individuals, and not be exploited as artifacts or wealthy art objects. And so it was under that law that Jack filed the original lawsuit. But the original contract back in the early 50s, when Patsy signed that contract with Mount Chunk, that was like, what would you call it? It was like white man's law. It was like Anglo-American jurisprudence. It was law. It was a contract. However bizarre we may think it was, nevertheless, it was a legally binding contract. She, as the widow, had the final say as to what would happen to her husband's remains. So, on the other hand, you had this burial ceremony interrupted in Shawnee when he was dead, and she yanked the body away. And you had another kind of law, another kind of spiritual and Native American law that said, no, that's not right, that his burial should be completed and his remains should come back to where he began, not someplace he never was. So those two laws are, in a way, irreconcilable in the case of Jim Thorpe. The Supreme Court denied cert. They will not hear it. So it's over unless they can find some other way. And he'll stay in Jim Thorpe. And it remains one of the strangest stories in American history, not to mention sports.
Yeah, it really is the kind of thing that, like you said, you can't really make up.
No, you can't. I mean, think of Ted Williams, Isn't his head? And cyrogenically, you can look it up. I mean, the only other parallel is poor Ted Williams, another great athlete. But this is by far, there's nothing like this story. Nothing. I mean, it is really, you can't make it up. You can't make it up. So
did you talk?
Go ahead.
Did you talk to anybody in Jim Thorpe about this? And I'm curious if there's anybody who would even consider giving the body back, not because they have to legally, but just because maybe they might feel that they don't really need the body to. I mean, to me, they can still call the name of their town Jim Thorpe, and it doesn't seem to me like they would lose a lot to give up the body. But I guess it's been there for 60 years, so it's probably pretty entwined in their pride.
Well, yeah, I felt like you. I felt like there could be a win-win early on, that they could do just what you said. They could say, all right, look, we respect the family, and the family said, keep the name, keep everything.
Right.
Give us those bones or whatever's left. But what you have in Jim Thorpe, yes, I did speak to, I think his name is Jim Dugan. You can double-check it in the book.
Okay.
Who had grown up in Jim Thorpe. And his parents had owned one of the oldest stores there on the main street. And I also spoke to the daughter of the newspaper publisher who originally negotiated with Patsy, who was a very thoughtful man and really loved his town and wanted to save it. And she was the one who clarified, how deeply her father wanted to save the town, and how bizarre that idea was at the beginning, but then how he came around. She remembered sitting up, looking over the staircase, I think I say it in the book, looking over the stair railing in their house and seeing Patsy and thinking what a strange-looking person she was in the house to negotiate with her father and the other village elders. Jim Dugan was someone whose family's been there forever. He said, it's in the book, he said, the average person in Jim Thorpe doesn't spend 1 minute thinking about Jim Thorpe, the athlete. I mean, but there's this group of small-town boosters, the Jim Thorpe Association, who have done wonderful work and very good people, but they're the ones that, it's a teeny town. This is their claim to fame.
Right.
They're not going to give it up.
Right.
I mean, I've lived in small towns, and they're wonderful, but particularly if they're isolated like that one, it gets a little strange. And they have a whole association, and they have events, and they're not going to give that up. And now they don't have to.
Right. And do you have any future books in the works?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I have one with my agent at the moment. I can't really talk about it.
Yeah, okay.
It happens.
Right.
It's kind of a biography of a general. It's a little different, and I'm also in the process of setting up a company with another biographer.
Oh, okay.
Called Biography by Design. Yeah, and it's a company that we're going to do private biographies. Biographies for families or individuals or nonprofits, organizations. I've done a couple of those. They're really wonderful projects and bring our biographical skills to help other people tell their stories.
Sorry, did you say biography of a general? I think it cut out a little bit.
Biography of a generation.
A generation. Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
okay.
not a general. No, there might be a general in there.
Okay.
No, it's an unusual idea, and I have to see if it's going to work. But
I
it would be wonderful if it does. That's a book that'll be commercial.
Right.
This company is to do these books for individuals and organizations. Which, I've done a couple of them. It's been really terrific work. So.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for your time today. I really appreciate it. Like I said, it was a great book. I really had a great time.
Yeah.
And next time I'm back in Pennsylvania, I'm definitely gonna go to Jim Thorpe and see the grave.
Yeah. And in Carlisle, go see the Indian.
Yeah, I did do that too.
Something.
Yeah, for sure.
It's intact.
Yeah, thanks again, and I hope you have a nice holiday.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you, Nick, so much, and have a great holiday.
Yeah, you too.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. So thanks very much to Kate for talking to me about her book. Really interesting stuff. There's so many layers, angles, and dimensions to Jim Thorpe's story. His early life growing up in Indian country, the early days of football in America, the Olympics, his pro career, Hollywood, the burial controversy. There's just so much to talk about. And once again, her website is www.katebuford.com, and the book is Native American Son, The Life and Sporting Legend of Jim Thorpe. As for me, if you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to me at sweeto37@gmail.com. You can subscribe to the Olympic Legends podcast on iTunes. And soon, once I get it set up, you can also subscribe to the Outstanding Authors podcast. And you can find me online at themacgyverproject.blogspot.com and follow me on Twitter at Project MacGyver. Thanks, and see you next time.